Trades Union Liaison Officer from Chester CLP. Welcome, Mike. I asked Mike if he would do a talk before Christmas, and he said, yeah, he'll definitely do it after Christmas. And when I offered him the 25th of January, he politely refused that date. He said he had a previous engagement. So, being a really nice person that I am, I said, no problem, Mike, can you do the following week? And so Mike is with us tonight, and he's actually going to give a talk about collective action in an isolationist world. So, just remembered, the reason why he couldn't do last week is he had this prior appointment with a bottle of scotch and a haggis. It was Burns night. Good to see you, Mike, and I'll leave it all over to you now. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you, David. Yeah, I'm going to touch on some of the issues that were raised in the presentation earlier, actually, in terms of employment rights and the effect of Brexit. I mean, that's one of the main concerns, I think, that trade unionists had as to what extent they would be altered. To some extent, Kwasi Kwarteng has taken the wind out of my sails because he appears to have said that there will be no review of European employment rights. Now, I would predicate that with two things. First of all, they didn't vote to make it a legal condition that they wouldn't withdraw those changes. And as with all Tories, that I think it's simply a matter of time before they revisit that. So I will touch on it a little bit later, because I think it is important that we address that. First of all, let's get started with the pessimistic stuff. In 1980, there were 12.2 million trade union members in the UK. By 2016, that had dropped to a low of 6.23 million. There has been a slight increase in the past few years to 6.4 million, but that's only just short of 24% of the total workforce. It doesn't take a genius, and you probably don't need me to point out what the reason for that drop was. It simply was the wholesale attack by Margaret Thatcher and the Tories on both the industrial base of the UK, from which was largely, almost exclusively trade unionised, and also a parallel attack upon trade unions themselves by restricting their right to organise, restricting their right to take industrial action, particularly supportive industrial action. And it's been a success. And we're only now starting to claw back lost membership. But what I would say is a lot of that has actually come about in the past year or so because of COVID, because of people's concerns as to their job security. One of the worrying things that comes out of the statistics, though, is that less than 25% of trade union members are below the age of 34, and over 40% are over the age of 50. Now, given the demographic changes in the workforce, there is a disconnect really between trade unions and younger people. And I just want to posit an idea for that. And I do think it is partly cultural, and it's a cultural development which is fitted in with, I think, a long-term conservative plan to weaken unions, to limit collective action, and to, the word I use is atomize the workplace so that we become individuals having to survive on our own rather than by instinct being part of a collective and being part of trade union movement. I always put this little fact in at this time, particularly when I'm giving tours in my professional life as a trade union lawyer, is that when you look at the developments of the industrial tribunal, now employment tribunal system, people often forget that they were actually created by a Conservative government as part of a measure to take away disputes from the workplace and to effectively limit the power of trade unions by appearing to give individuals greater freedoms and greater rights. It's a chimera. That's not what has happened. And I'll touch on some new changes and new developments in law, which are potentially going to further weaken trade unions' role and trade unions' ability to take collective action. Well, what can we say about positives? What can we say about membership of the trade union movement now? Well, I've mentioned a slight growth. One interesting fact is that the female membership of trade unions is now the highest it's been since 1995. The recent increase that we've seen has been in both the public and the private sectors. And the other issue as well is that trade unions, when they organise collectively within the workplace, are more or less guarantors of better terms and conditions for workers within those workplaces. Just recently, for example, Usdaw, as part of its pay negotiations with Morrison's, has secured a minimum basic hourly rate of £10 an hour, which is, I think, something that needs to be celebrated. And certainly from Usdaw's perspective, having spoken to them, this is a strategy which they would like to roll across all other sectors in which they have members, principally the larger supermarkets, who, let's face it, have actually been one of the prime beneficiaries of this crisis because they've been allowed to stay open. People are buying more because they're going out less. And those facts, I think, are facts which need to be emphasised and need to be stressed, certainly by the trade union movement, that there are beneficiaries and have been beneficiaries of this crisis. Those beneficiaries have included some of the already wealthiest people on the planet. And you only have to look at Amazon's sales to realise that. And what were already obscene amounts of profit being made by those companies have just gone beyond obscenity. And one of the features, certainly of a politically engaged trade union movement, is to engage with that and to focus, I think, a creative and a productive anger, which should then feed back into securing better terms and conditions, and, in my view, would be a vehicle for the growth and development of the trade union movement in sectors and areas where they are underrepresented because of the nature of the work which is undertaken by people who work in Amazon production centres and in other areas. What are the challenges? Well, there are significant challenges. We've already mentioned fire and rehire, which is now a feature with British Gas. I don't know if you've seen the vans, which one was parked prominently by a Hull roundabout with a striking British Gas employee, drawing attention to fire and rehire. What does fire and rehire mean? For those of you who don't know, it's a contractual arrangement. Effectively, what you, the employer, does is issue employees with notice of termination of their existing contract, and thereafter issue them with new contracts in circumstances where, if they object to the new contracts, and in some cases sign under protest, you, the employer, will say, well, that you're making that a condition of the change. We're not prepared to accept it. So either sign it or you go. That's a perfectly legal tactic, provided proper procedures are followed by the employer. For example, it has to negotiate collectively with any recognised trade union. But then at the conclusion of that collective negotiation, if no agreement is reached, it simply has to give the relevant notice to the individual employee, who then faces a choice whether to sign the new agreement or whether to accept it and go back to work. The power there of an organised workforce is that it can take industrial action. And that is precisely what British Gas employees are doing at the moment. One of the other issues as well, which has been on the cards for quite some time, which I think will become increasingly relevant, is the continued mechanisation of the workplace. Many, many years ago, I went to the Tesco distribution centre out in Middlewich, and that's a huge warehouse operation. There was hardly anybody in the warehouse. It was all being moved and carried by automated stacker trucks. Now, the argument there is that that generates profit for employers. Okay, they've got to buy the kit, they've got to buy the equipment, but they don't have to pay robots wages. And again, the trade union movement's position on this is quite simply that if more time becomes available because of mechanisation, that should lead to reduced hours, but not reduced pay, and certainly not reduced jobs. There's also, and I've got my lawyer's hat on here, a very interesting Supreme Court case coming up later in the year. It's a case called Costal and Dunkley and others. What happened there is that Costal were in pay negotiations with Unite, who represented their members in the workplace. Those pay negotiations broke down and the union balloted successfully to refuse the pay deals, and were going to take initial steps towards industrial action. What the employer then did was to write individually to the employees who were members of the trade union to say, well, if you don't agree, you're going to be losing bonuses. And subsequently, they indicated to the employees that if you don't agree to our deal, you're going to be losing your jobs. Now, that was taken to the Employment Tribunal, where the employees were successful. The argument there is that is prohibited action under Section 145B of the Trade Union and Labour Relations Consolidation Act, which says that you an employer can't engage in a process where you offer an inducement to people to abandon collective representation, which the Employment Tribunal found Costal had done. Costal appealed that decision to the Employment Appeal Tribunal, which agreed with the Employment Tribunal. Costal then appealed that to the Court of Appeal, who unfortunately agreed that that wasn't an inducement to abandon collective bargaining. That case is going to come before the Supreme Court later this year. The concern is that if the company win at the Supreme Court, there's no further right of appeal, can't take it anywhere. Now we've left the European Union's legal framework structures. And that will be a green light for employers to offer inducements behind the back of collective representation. I'm actually familiar with this with a large bus company in Manchester, which had previously always negotiated again with Unite for Christmas enhancements to be paid to bus drivers. On this occasion, lo and behold, following the appointment of a new director and new head of the company, they didn't even bother entering into collective action. They just wrote individually to the employees saying, this is what the bonus is going to be. And that itself may be the subject of legal challenge. That said, though, there are positives. And one of the most positive things that have happened in the Northwest, I think, recently, is the industrial dispute at Rolls-Royce in Barnoldswick, which resulted in 350 jobs being saved. Rolls-Royce is at the heart of that community. And also, and I'll probably touch on this in the talk which I give tomorrow, one of the points there is that one of the union's conditions was that the company should look at research and development into green technology, and to keep that in the UK, where the company was intending to move that offshore away from the UK. One thing I would mention, and this is something which union officers certainly always are concerned about, is that their workload has grown exponentially. And this was the case pre-COVID. COVID has made things, in some cases, much worse, and in some cases actually much better, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. But where they have representation in fragmented workplaces, that is where you don't have a large trade union membership and you don't have a collective agreement. The effort and time that has to be spent on servicing those members is considerably more than it would be in dealing with the members, for example, of Vauxhalls or Airbus or Bentley's or JLR, where effectively the standing army of shop stewards, if I can call it that, actually do the day-to-day representation. Although even that's being challenged now. And I think John will probably agree with me, as that's one of the features of the new new owners at Vauxhalls. It is that what had happened previously is no longer the case. And that's gone side by side with increasing use of casual agency workers as opposed to core workers. They tend to be younger, and they tend not to be trade union members. The other issue as well, and this is something that people often forget about, is that there has been a growth in legal expenses insurance. And one of the prime features of the trade unions, the offerings they can make to individuals in the workplace, is legal representation for accidents and employment tribunal claims. In some ways, younger people are more used, I think, to actually obtaining that themselves. Usually it comes free with your motor insurance or your household insurance. So one of the things that is often said, and I've seen it said, is, well, why do I need to be in a trade union when I can get this from my insurer? And again, that's a struggle the trade union has got to address, not simply by saying we can offer this, but why this is important. And it's important because, and I keep coming back to this point, workers in collective workplaces have better pay terms and conditions. And that's a simple message, and one that needs always to be emphasised. Right, coming on to what are the two subtopics, if you like. And the first one is Brexit. Now, this also hits on the idea of an isolationist world, because what we've done by Brexiting from the European Union is isolated ourselves from one of the largest trading blocs within the world, and with no roadmap to take us forward. And I know there has been some considerable concern about the Labour Party's stance on the Brexit agreement at the end of last year. But I would draw your attention to a letter which the Deputy General Secretary of Unite, Steve Turner, the effectively runs the manufacturing sector of the union, wrote to all Labour MPs to stress that this was the only deal in town, because had it not been approved, had it not been accepted, we would have left without a deal. And in those circumstances, the consequences to manufacturing would be absolutely appalling. I mentioned Barn-Oldswick earlier. One of the points there is that Rolls-Royce wanted to move out of the UK. We're already seeing rumblings from some employers about relocating, and that's always been a problem. One of the concerns, and people don't often appreciate this, is quite a lot of production for JLR is now undertaken in China through a factory which was set up there principally for the purpose of developing cars for the local Chinese and indeed Indian markets. China imposed prohibitive duties on the import of completed vehicles, to such an extent that at JLR, against a factory I used to deal with a lot, we're basically sending out cars as basically kit cars for reassembly in China, but now it has its own manufacturing facility there. Also, Airbus has its own manufacturing facility within China for the construction of wings, which have always traditionally been made at Bolton. Also, there's some talk, or has been talk, of developing factories in Saudi Arabia, which are close to aluminium sites, which are increasingly being used for the manufacture of the planes themselves. I mentioned Kwasi Kwarteng's apparent U-turn on a review of EU employment rights. I think I will touch on that. And there are two in particular that I wanted to focus on. I mean, Dave's mentioned one of them, and that is the working time regulations. It's worth remembering that when the working time directive was first published, Margaret Thatcher objected to it. Now, had this been an employment directive, then, i.e. to do with employment rights, then that would not have got through, because at that time, Council needed a unanimous decision of all its members. It was developed quite cleverly, I think, by the European Union as a health and safety measure, which only needed a majority voting. The reason behind that was because, and they've touched on this with the holiday comparison, is that it is accepted generally, and it seems self-evidently true, that if you work long hours, then you're going to be exposing yourself to a risk of injury. And if you don't have any holiday, then again, you're not getting breaks that you need. And the important point here is that people often didn't take holidays, even if they're entitled to them, simply because they didn't get paid for them. And what the working time regulations do is to provide for payment, as well as providing for a upper level of 48 hours for the working week, unless there is an opt-out. And employees do opt out of it. And quite often, I know it, people are opting out because they feel that if they don't, then their jobs could potentially be at risk, or the prospects of their employment could potentially be at risk. I think that will be revisited by this government at some stage. As it looks, they're going to carry on for a number more years. And it would take just a simple withdrawal of what is the working time regulations for this right to disappear. And then people would only have a contractual entitlement, if they have a contractual entitlement in their contracts of employment, to holidays. The other bit of legislation or regulation that I do always raise at this stage is TUPE, Transfer of Undertakings Protection of Employment Regulations. And what they say is that if your employer sells the business, or if a new employer comes in, then your existing terms and conditions largely have to remain the same. There are some exceptions to that, but importantly, terms in relation to pay, terms in relation to benefits, terms in relation to hours, terms in relation to job role remain the same. That's always been a very important protection where employers contract out their workforce, something called a service provision change. So, for example, if a factory employs its own in-house catering staff, if they decide to contract that out to usual suspects of Serco, etc., then people who have those existing roles will then be able to retain those terms and conditions on the transfer, and the terms and conditions can't be changed if the reason for the change is a reason related to the transfer. And importantly, in those circumstances, what also transfers over is the right to continue in a trade union, which is a right anyway, but more importantly, any recognition agreement. It's not perfect, because what often happens is that the size of the workforce gets watered down. When people leave, they're replaced by people on lesser terms and conditions, and quite often those people just don't join trade unions. But it is an important safety guard, certainly for those employees who are affected by those transfers. The issue here, and this lies within the fire and rehire provisions, is that I think any employer actually, if the TUPE regulations changed, any employer looking to contract out is probably more likely to seek to change terms and conditions before a transfer, which would now be illegal if it was related to the transfer, simply to make the contract more attractive to anybody coming in, to ensure that they would have a lesser price for that contract. So those are two areas where I think there are concerns, notwithstanding what happened this weekend, are issues which are unlikely to simply go away. They will always be there. And again, come back to the point that I made, challenges for trade unions to ensure that people are aware of those dangers, aware of those risks, and aware that the best way of securing and maintaining those rights is by membership of trade union in a collectively organised workplace. Come on to that. When I just look at COVID for a while, I heard today that Airbus workers at Bolton had just voted to agree a reduction in their hours. Effectively, what that does is it ensures that there will not be any compulsory redundancies at Bolton. And that is, again, positive evidence of what you can do with collective action. I think it's only in a recognised workplace that can be done. In fact, again, in my professional life, I've had a number of cases from Usdaw where people have had their hours simply reduced unilaterally, where there is no collective organisation and there's just individual members within the workplace, largely former co-op employees who've transferred over and transferred over and transferred over when the co-op itself has been split down and effectively brutalised and sold off. Is COVID all bad for actions from the workplace? I mean, interestingly, I had a conversation with a number of trade union officials last week, and I thought, and my initial view would be that given that people are increasingly working from home, that there's no social interaction, that the opportunities to organise collectively, the opportunities to interact with other employees would have diminished, and that would have impacted upon trade union representation and trade unions' effectiveness. The message I got back from all of the trade union people, and there's from Usdaw, CWU, Unite in particular, were that having meetings remotely has actually encouraged participation. Is that people aren't having to come out on a Sunday. There's one Unite branch always used to meet in Ellesmere Port on a Sunday. They just call in. Equally, one of the regional secretaries has said to me that he doesn't now have to go down to London to meet with his colleagues, is they can all just have a remote Zoom meeting to discuss what they would have had to travel down to London or to some other venue for. And that's improved their communication and effectiveness. One thing that did surprise me, though, is that the Communication Workers Union, who have a very, very active youth section, found that while their membership involvement and engagement has actually increased because of Zoom meetings, it hasn't increased with a younger age group because their preference is for the social interaction of meetings. And it just seemed counterintuitive to me, but I understand it. I mean, I've given talks to that particular section, and they're all incredibly social. They're all incredibly young as well, and all so incredibly eager to discuss matters and discuss things with each other as individuals as well as collectively. And that is also one of the downsides of meetings that trade union representatives have had with employers, is that the opportunity simply to go into an employer to discuss a concern or to have a off-the-record conversation as part of a formal meeting has, I won't say diminished, but reduced. The meetings are more formal and participation is more or less by open communication rather than the behind the hand or behind the door communication, which can often resolve disputes much quicker than a formal meeting can. I've actually personally recognised this because more recently, the employment tribunals have organised themselves so that trials can be held remotely. What we'd normally do if we had an employment tribunal is we all pitch up at 9 o'clock and I'd try and get it settled before 10, before we had to go before the judge. Now what happens is that the meeting starts at 10 and you've got no opportunity to speak to your opponent and to do that off-quoted thing, settle on the door of the court. The other issue, I don't know if this is positive or not, it was mentioned to me, and I won't say by which trade union, is that because they haven't been having annual conferences, that the opportunity to address issues related to disaffiliation from the Labour Party have not really been addressed. And that is currently, it is a potential problem. And that's a potential problem which the Labour Party needs to grapple with. I'm not here to criticise any politicians in particular, but it seems that the Labour Party does need to recognise that it is the political wing of the trade union movement and can't, in my view, expect to continue to receive large sums of money in circumstances where it's often engaged in attacking those very unions which provide that financial support. So that is an issue for, I think, the Labour Party, but it's also an issue for the trade union movement as to what it wants to do in terms of its political representation. So just to summarise, I don't think it's all doom and gloom. I think that so long as the message can be got out that collective action is the way to secure your employment rights and the way to better terms and conditions within the workplace, then that's the message the trade union movement can give, and it can answer its own message by saying we can provide that. And the two examples that I've gave, I think, are very good examples of that. Rolls-Royce at Barn Oldwick and Airbus at Bolton. Collective action secured employment in both of those cases. In one case, it was an industrial dispute. In another case, it was an agreement to agree to an interim change in terms and conditions. One pessimistic note, and this is a personal viewpoint, is I don't actually think we've seen the worst of this situation in terms of its effect on jobs. I think the furlough scheme, which is due to end at the end of April, has actually kicked the can down the road, and that we are going to see, if the vaccine doesn't result in us getting back to some form of normal, large swathes of the workforce being struck down by redundancy and unemployment. And again, the people to protect them in those circumstances is the trade union movement, which is why there's been a small growth, or not small growth, a growth in membership since COVID hit. That's all I really have to say. So I welcome any comments or any questions that people may have.
Thank you very much indeed, Mike. That's absolutely brilliant. To ask any questions, what I'd like you to do is to use your raised hand, as you can see in the top left hand or right there. You can see my hand has come up, and you can do that quite easily. And I will call upon you to ask a question. Please don't give a speech, just a question. We got the very first one up at the moment, and I've seen that it's Alison. Alison, question to Mike.
Hello, Mike. I really enjoyed your presentation. I've got loads of questions. I'll just ask one. would you say, I've just come from a meeting, I've turned into a Zoom junkie, and I heard about a meeting today by a group in Scotland called the National Unemployed Workers Movement. How useful do you think something like that would be right now in the current climate?
I think it is, and Night to Be Fair had an organisation for unemployed people, and that was, I think, one of Len McCluskey's particular babies, which does actually represent people in those circumstances. They've got a seat on United Council, and it is about organising people, because even before this crisis, being on your own and being out of the workplace was soul destroying. So that was a method by which people could get together, but also importantly, and this is Len McCluskey's intention, was to organise politically, to keep their concerns on the agenda by representing collectively the voice of unemployed and disadvantaged people. So yes, I think that's an ideal stance.
Next question from Trish.
Hello there. Hi, everybody.
Yeah.
My sort of comment is how, for everyone to have a think about, how do we make young people realise the benefits of trade unionism when they don't remember when trade unions, really did help people and it was always in the news and so on. I think everything, is affected by fashion. And I just think we've become very dated and out of fashion. My two children, dragged up, in a socialist home, I treated them to their trade union membership for their first year of employment. And later on, they confessed to me, they left their trade unions. I mean, they should know better, but they're under this ridiculous notion that they work for decent employers.
I think that this is a little criticism of trade unions, is I don't think they do enough to focus on young people in and outside the workplace. I gave an example of CWU, who do actually focus on young people, certainly in Northwest region, because the regional secretary is very, very positive about that and recognises the need to get people into the uni at an early stage. But again, we're pushing against a media which is dominated by the right wing. You're looking at fake news on social media as well. And all those things, I think, conspire against that sense of collective action. And also, young people are more likely to change jobs regularly. So they're not in the workplace for that period of time where they'll be next to somebody who's, an old timer like me and says, well, you really need to be in a trade union. That's my view on that.
Yeah, that's good, Matt. I want a young person to come in now, and Matt Carter's got his hand up. Matt.
My question is, I am of course now a union member since where I now work is unionised. However, the cost of a low paid worker on Unite's pay scale for union membership is higher than the national minimum wage. And I think that would be one of the especially for people who are on 0-hour contracts, one of the biggest drawbacks to the cost to it. I could have fluctuated between 48 hours, so I'd have been doing full time, to 8 hours. So to be paying £10 a month, of course, with other, especially if they're having to pay their day-to-day bills, it would just be, they'd be incapable of it, even if they did see the benefits. I think that's one of the big issues facing a lot of young people.
Yes, it is. I appreciate that.
John Fellison.
I can't lower my hand.
Can't you? That's a shame, Trish. John. John, you'll have to unmute before you start. There
Thanks,
you are,
Mike.
you've unmuted.
Yeah. I'm just curious. I mean, Ulster, no disrespect, are not noted for being the most militant of unions, yet they did, in effect, it seems, secure a good deal with Morrison's. What were do you know, understanding what the negotiating stance was? Because I bet they couldn't have threatened industrial action, could they? Because they never delivered. Not being disrespectful to them, it's difficult for them. And hopefully where Morrison's go, the rest will follow. But what persuaded Morrison, apart from wasn't a great, strong union? You may have a difference of opinion, Mike.
Yeah, I think it was a sort of a moral approach to them. This is the right thing to do, to reward the workforce. I mean, Morrison's, there's always a lot to do with Morrison's. And they always used to be a rather odd organisation. It was run like a corner shop. And it was, I remember doing a case for Unite against Morrison's where they wouldn't let a trade union official a trade union officer go to a training meeting on the new driver regulations. Their argument being that as he'd on the night shift and he'd finished at 8 o'clock, he could go to the meeting in Salford for 9 o'clock and then come back and start his night shift. And we won that case. It was a 2-day hearing in Employment Tribunal in Liverpool. And it must have cost them about £10,000 in legal fees for a claim which was worth a couple of £100. I think that there's been I suppose a sea change there. And I mean, Ulster, could I say that they have ways of sweetening deals with employers that perhaps other unions don't have?
Interesting. Andrew Price, then we're going to follow up with Anne and then Ray. So, Andy.
Okay, cheers. Thanks, Mike. I'm just wondering...
Could you speak, come a bit closer to the mic, please, Andy?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. You were talking about the decline of the unions, and it's been huge. And I'm just wondering whether you would agree that the decline's gone on at the same time as the decline in industrial disputes has gone on. And the reason for that is that a lot of trade unions, maybe because of the law and other things, have gone to the law as a default. The first thing they do is go to the lawyers. What can the lawyers do? If the lawyers can't do anything, end of story, and we end up with a bad deal. And I'm just wondering whether you think that move by trade unions, and in particular mainstream trade unions, to go towards a legal avenue rather than an industrial avenue has played its part in that reduction. And that whether you think as a way of unions becoming relevant to people, and that's relevant to young people in particular, that they need to go down the avenue of the United Voices and the Independent Workers of Great Britain, who actually go out there and organise vulnerable workers, people who are in difficult professions. They organise them, they negotiate on the basis of industrial strength, not on the basis of is it legal or isn't it legal. And they're getting huge results. And I wonder whether you would agree as well that when they go to industrial tribunals, which they do, they get better payouts because of their industrial muscle and because they're known as a union not to mess with. So just wondering that, just on to finish up on there. So the question really is about the decline. And I know it would put you out of a job if they didn't go to the law, but don't you think that they've just relied too much on the law?
I think there has been one of the things I often say to even union officers, look, we don't live in a workers' democracy. If you're going to an employment tribunal, you're going into a room which is being presided over by a employment judge who's probably spent most of their time working for employers. So it's not an opportunity for you to basically seek industrial democracy through the employment tribunal. I think there has been a reluctance to take the sort of industrial action which would have been taken, certainly in the 70s or even in the 80s, simply because of the restrictions on trade unions and the fear in many cases of sequestration. So, I mean, by the time there are so many hurdles to get over in terms of getting the balloting right. And the law has, in some way, actually forced trade unions to go down a legal route in order to ensure that they resist injunctions and that the ballots are deemed to be acceptable. My own experience is slightly different in that I've always had worked with, well, in particular, United Transport and General Workers Union, as they were, on a joint industrial and legal strategy. I mean, two issues spring to mind. One is I did a large case in Wales involving Friction Dynamics, the former Ferodo factory in Carnarvon, which where the company wanted to get rid of the trade unions, so it sacked them after industrial disputes, not realising that the law had changed, which meant that you can't sack somebody in what was a protected period of 6 weeks at that point. So in addition to actually having an industrial dispute, which continued after their dismissal and lasted for 2 years, we also ran an employment tribunal claim, which resulted in our being successful, both in the tribunal, subsequently in the Court of Appeal in a related case. And the other one I did, again, in Wales, involved industrial disputes involving the point of air, which I advised that the company's intention to reduce wages unilaterally could potentially be lawful, but a joint industrial and legal strategy meant that was resolved. And I think that is the way forward. And I do agree that a lot of the younger unions, which you've identified, actually have that as a strategy. So first of all, they're proactively engaged with the workforce, many of whom are in very vulnerable positions, many of whom are very low paid, but they also instruct lawyers to look at the legal angles that they can use, not as an alternative to an industrial strategy, but as adjunct to it. And I think that the successes they've had have been significant, simply because an employer is then faced with a workforce that is both discontented and taking industrial action, but is also discontented and taking legal action. And that's the way to get either results or get things resolved. So I do agree with you.
Well, that's cool, Mike. Thank you very much. Anne, a question.
It's not so much a question, it's a comment or a contribution. I understand, Matt, about the membership. The fee for the membership is expensive if you're on if your contract or 0 hour contract. I understand that, but there are some unions, especially Unite unions, your membership can be from 50 pence a week up to Driver Express Plus. So even if you're on a 0 hour contract or a reduced hours contract, there will be a grade, there'll be a payment for you, even if you're unemployed, it's 50 pence. And it does give you some legal protection as well. And I think with the coming, the end of this year, with the furlough coming to end, and the unemployment that we know we're going to get, and the contracts that may be changed, the most vulnerable people are going to be the unemployed and the contractors, the people who are contracted in. Their direct employees have some, in a unionised place, have some protection, but all the others have very little. And I think by the end of the year, they're going to get even less. And if especially young people who think, well, I'm paying £10, I'm only getting, I don't know, I'm only getting 30 hours a month, and £10 of that is going on union fees. I can understand them saying it's too much. But I think the whole idea, I think, is to get into the young people and explain it's not just about the money, but is about the protection. The payment is about the protection and also the enhancement of their paying conditions.
That's cool. Thank you very much indeed, Anne. We've got a little bit of time left. We'll go to Ray, and then I know that Vicky wants to ask a question. I hope there are questions. Ray?
Yeah, mine's not a question.
I didn't think it would be somehow, Ray.
No, it was interesting, some of the things that were being said. I mean, we were talking about fire and rehire, and we shouldn't forget that Quack fired and rehired its whole workforce in 2012. And they said if you signed under protest, not to bother turning up for work because you'd just be sent home again, so they wouldn't even allow you to do that. Fortunately, through that combination of, we did have industrial action, but that because the new contracts mainly affected about a quarter of the staff, mainly the women care workers, that was quite hard to broaden that action. But under a threat of legal action over a breach of TUPE, because we'd just been brought together as 4 local authorities, we did eventually get a settlement on that, which restored many of those terms and conditions. So it took about 3 years to do it. And you were talking about contracting out of staff, which I thought...
Ray, could you lean a bit further forward, because we're having difficulty hearing you.
Sorry about that. So you were talking about contracting out and the staff there. I mean, a big thing, although you say terms and conditions are protected, which is quite right if you're transferred, one of the changes in 2014 is that you don't necessarily have a right to continue with previously agreed contractual terms. So in Cheshire West again, when the school meals and school cleaning staff were outsourced in 2015, although they got their terms and conditions protected, they didn't get the council pay rise. And actually, so within 4 months of being outsourced to a company which was fully owned by 2 councils, half the workforce ended up on the minimum wage. It's supposed to be TUPE protections if the company is still involved in the agreement, but none of the unions seemed interested in taking up the fact that the 2 councils owned the company that was employing these people, but weren't feeling bound by the national agreement that they'd transferred under. So that was quite interesting. Last point was equal pay, I think, is quite interesting in terms of TUPE. It does look like TUPE seems to potentially permanently override equal pay. Our council refuse company was brought together 8 years ago by several private companies and Ellesmere Port Borough Council staff, and 8 years later the staff are all still on different terms and conditions, and the fact that you've got women drivers and male drivers from those different companies all on different pay rates seems not to be something that anyone feels can be challenged, because the notion that the TUPE protection protects the employer from being challenged under equal pay even 8 years after the transfers.
So I was going to say that's actually a live issue. I had a case which we almost would have got to the Court of Appeal on that point to see whether or not, if you like, equal pay trumps TUPE. Rather oddly, we succeeded at the Court of Appeal, and the thing was remitted back to the Employment Tribunal. We found actually there wasn't any issue with equal pay in the first place, so we never actually got to run that argument. But yeah, that's an issue. The fact is that where you do have workers transferring out of a workplace where there is a collective recognition, then what you do see, and I'm not alive to this because I see it all the time, is that because TUPE works more or less as a frozen moment, is that quite often the employer will say, well, you're on more pay than so-and-so in our company is, so we're not giving you a pay rise unless you've got an entitlement to a pay rise, and unless there's some discrimination issue there. Basically, you're just peddling to stay still until the other workers catch up with you. Or what generally happens, and I won't name companies' names, but a situation where effectively 3 large companies merged through TUPE in circumstances where they were all on different terms and conditions. And it quickly became apparent what the successor company was going to do to those who were on the better terms and conditions, and they all just left. and they're left with agreements, as you'll know yourself, is often what happens in those circumstances. So yeah, TUPE is not perfect, but it's better than nothing. And if we didn't have it, and my concern is that if the Tories do go back to look at employment protection deriving from European directives, then I think that we'd lose that protection, limited as it may be.
Vicky, you'll have to unmute. Thank you.
I'm unmuted now. Oh, thank you so much for that presentation. There's a lot of food for thought. And I have been thinking a lot about trade unions, and I know I've spoken, had discussions with Rachel and Mike about my thoughts, which have now solidified. So I thought I might sort of come back to you on a couple of issues. First of all, we have to know what the role of trade unions is, I think. And to my mind, it is the collective representation of workers in the workforce. And it's needed because the relationship between an employer and an employee is unequal. And unless we all act together, we can't improve things because their power will always trump you. So that is their crucial role. And I think the reason why there's been this tremendous fall off in trade union membership is because they're not carrying out their historic role of collective action. And I've thought about why that is. And part of it, I think, is because they've fallen into the trap that has been laid out for them with this floor of legal rights, which Europe has offered us. I mean, at the time when Thatcher was at her full height, I used to think, oh, thank God for Europe, because if it wasn't for these directives and things, you know, we wouldn't be able to do anything. We'd be stuck, you know, we'd be absolutely dreadful. So what's happened as a result of that is the unions have connived in this legal framework that has served only to enmesh people. And as a result of the unions not being active enough, under our noses, the whole work experience has changed beyond all recognition, so that we now have this gig economy, which would be unthinkable in years gone by. And the reliance on individual rights in tribunals. I mean, Mike's in the presentation, he's already explained how this can be difficult. First of all, to identify your rights, to apply your those to your situation, and then get the union to support you on those legal rights. Well, you know, before all that, that wouldn't have happened. If there's something wrong, the union rep would have gone to the employer, and if a negotiation wouldn't come about, there'd be industrial action to force it and settle it. But instead, we've been enmeshed. And the other problem with the individual rights, I think, is in employment tribunals. It's a very intimidating arena. And it's more so now because of costs. So people think they can, you know, apply to the tribunal and it's a cost-free forum. It isn't. It's not a cost-free forum. They have the power to award costs of £20,000. Employers will use that to intimidate people from bringing their claims. And the whole thing is fraught, even like your time limits and things like that. It's not easy. And then the employer will be always represented, you know, so that's the other unequal thing. So my view is, I've changed my view, is that I think it might be a good thing if we don't have this legal floor of rights to rely on, which then becomes a common denominator for everything. And if you don't, if you've got no legal right, then the union isn't going to do anything. And we go back to the collective action and become relevant. Unions become relevant to workers, and then hopefully the membership will rise. Just a thought.
Thank you, Vicky, and it's a very good thought as well. Mike, do you want to reply to that?
I would feel very uncomfortable if we didn't have a floor of legal rights. Steve Turner, in his letter to Labour MPs, said that the deal, the Brexit deal, was a floor, not a ceiling. And what we ought to do, and what they ought to be doing, is to build on that. I think where I do agree with you is that if you're going to achieve anything, then you're more likely to achieve it collectively than you are by just going through a legal route. The problem is the restrictions on taking collective action within the workplace, and the legal hoops that you've got to jump through in order to satisfy the law is a problem. And behind that, there is always, and this is a risk, and it is a consideration, is that there is the risk of sequestration if you have an illegal dispute. So it's not unusual for trade unions to have to disassociate itself formally from action taken by employees, union members, who haven't been through the appropriate legal channels, because a failure to do so would lead to an application against the trade union for the costs occasioned by that illegal dispute. And that automatically feeds back into the loop where people say, well, the union's not supporting me. And that is one particular problem. But we're here because that's what Thatcher did. The other thing I didn't mention was the abolition of the various wages councils as well in 1993, which is a major change, and it's something that I think trade unions ought to be revisiting. And that's a collective forum, so you're actually negotiating for terms and conditions on a regular basis. I mean, the Agricultural Wages Board was the last one to survive, and that went.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed, Mike. Before we finish, I would just like to make a comment about probably the last point you ever made. You didn't want to criticise anyone, and I certainly don't want to ruffle anyone's feathers, but I honestly believe that as a political education officer for Chester CLP, I've got to keep on reminding people where the Labour Party came from. The Labour Party came out of the trade unions. And one of the jobs is for the Labour Party is to support the working people of this country. And I've got to remind everyone in the Labour Party that's what we've got to continue to do. That's the first and foremost thing we've got to do. That's what I believe in. And that's what we've got to carry on doing.